Welcome to Void Histories, a place where the past does not rush, but drifts slowly, like echoes carried across a quiet valley at night. Here, history is more than dates and records. It is memory. It is silence. It is the lingering ache of lives interrupted and the lessons they leave behind. Tonight, we enter the Armenian Genocide, Empire's silence. Not only the story of a people persecuted, but of wounds that continue to speak, even when the world tries not to listen. As you hear these words, let your breath soften. Let the story flow gently, like a lullaby for restless hours. For history, when told slowly, becomes less a lecture and more a companion in the night. If you find comfort in these shadows, stay with us. There are many untold voices waiting, and together we will wander through them, quietly, patiently, until even silence begins to reveal its truths. The Armenian Genocide, Empire's silence. Before the silence of empire descended, before the long night of suffering began, Armenia was a land alive with its own rhythm. It was a place of mountains rising like ancient guardians, of valleys that stretched wide and green, of rivers glimmering in the soft light of dawn. Villages rested at the foot of hills, built from stone that carried the memory of centuries. Church bells rang in the morning, their echoes drifting gently across the landscape, mingling with the laughter of children and the sound of animals stirring to life. Life was not easy, for no land is free from hardship, but it carried dignity. Families gathered around wooden tables where bread was broken, not only as food, but as a sacred act of sharing. The flatbread baked in clay ovens was passed with reverence, as if each piece held history within it. Wine pressed from grapes, grown on stubborn vines, became both celebration and memory, a taste that linked the present to ancestors long gone. The evenings were filled with music, with the sound of the duduk, a haunting flute whose notes carried both joy and sorrow, echoing across the silence of valleys. The Armenian people had endured for centuries, shaping their lives around faith, tradition, and resilience. Their churches, built from black and red stone, stood firm against wind and time, their domes rising like prayers carved into the sky. Within them, candles flickered in shadows, illuminating painted icons that reminded the faithful of their story. Identity was strong, tied to the soil, to the faith, to the memory of a people who had always survived, even when empires rose and fell around them. This was the Armenia that existed before the shadow deepened. It was not a life untouched by difficulty. Taxes pressed heavily. Rulers shifted with time. Borders were threatened by foreign powers. Yet in the midst of all this, Armenians carried a sense of belonging. Their language, ancient and melodic, was spoken in every home. Their songs, whether of harvest or sorrow, were sung in every village. Their rituals, passed down through generations, marked the seasons of life. Births, marriages, deaths, all woven into the fabric of community. It is important to rest here, in this memory, because what was to come would try to erase it. To understand the depth of the wound, we must first hold the beauty of what existed. A land of fields and mountains, of children learning to write their first letters in an alphabet created more than 1,000 years earlier. People proud of their poets and scholars, of their artisans and builders, of the quiet strength that came from surviving in a land that was both harsh and generous. There was peace, fragile but real. On market days, the smell of spices and fresh bread filled the air. Merchants bartered with familiar voices. Neighbors exchanged stories. At night, families lit candles and prayed together, the flames dancing gently against stone walls, casting shadows that felt eternal. There was a rhythm to life, a steady heartbeat that carried from one generation to the next. And yet, beyond the borders of these villages, the Ottoman Empire looked upon its subjects with wary eyes. In the vastness of its rule, difference was often seen not as richness, but as danger. The Armenians, Christians in a Muslim empire, were tolerated but always watched. Though they paid their taxes, though they worked their land, though they lived in loyalty, suspicion never disappeared. The empire saw them not only as people, but as a problem to be managed, an identity to be contained. But here, in this opening, before the storm breaks, let us linger in the stillness of what once was. Let us hear the duduk's gentle notes. Let us see the candlelight glowing in stone churches. Let us imagine children running barefoot across fields while the sun sets behind the mountains. For only by remembering this peace, this belonging, can we feel the weight of what it meant to lose it. And as the night deepens in this story, as the silence begins to shift into something darker, we carry with us this image of Armenia as it was, whole, alive, deeply rooted in memory. For soon, the empire's silence will grow heavier, and the first cracks will appear in a world that had endured for so long. Conflict rarely begins with sudden thunder. More often, it comes quietly, like a shadow stretching further each evening, unnoticed until the darkness feels complete. For the Armenians within the Ottoman Empire, the beginnings of tragedy were not marked by one moment, but by a slow tightening of rules, suspicions, and silences that grew heavier with each passing year. At first, the empire's watchfulness was subtle. Armenians were classified as dhimmi, a protected but second-class status within the empire. They were allowed to practice their faith, but always under conditions: heavier taxes, limited rights, the constant reminder that their place was beneath those in power. For generations, many endured this quietly, carrying the weight of survival with dignity. But in the late 19th century, something shifted. The Ottoman Empire, once vast and proud, had begun to falter. Borders shrank, foreign powers pressed in, and rulers grew anxious. In such times, suspicion looks for targets, and minorities often bear the blame. Armenians, despite their loyalty, became the focus of growing distrust. Whispers spread that they harbored sympathies with Russia, that their Christian identity made them dangerous, that their very existence posed a threat to the fragile order of empire. These whispers became accusations, and accusations became policies. Local authorities imposed stricter measures, communities monitored, churches scrutinized, leaders watched closely, taxes rose higher, restrictions multiplied. Everyday life, once marked by the familiar rhythms of work and worship, became laced with unease. The erosion was slow, but its effect was profound. Children went to school under the weight of suspicion. Farmers carried grain to markets knowing much of it would be taken. Priests prayed in churches aware they were being watched. The empire's silence grew louder, silence not of peace, but of pressure, the silence that warns of something unspoken yet approaching. Tensions erupted at times into violence. In villages across Anatolia, Armenians faced raids, harassment, and sudden massacres. Neighbors who had lived side by side for generations found themselves divided by fear and manipulated by power. For Armenians, each outbreak of violence was both shock and warning, a reminder that safety was never certain, that their very lives depended on forces beyond their control. And yet, amid this growing pressure, Armenians still held on to their traditions. They lit candles in their churches, sang their songs, harvested their fields, celebrated births and marriages with as much joy as they could. This quiet resilience was its own form of defiance, a way of saying, we remain, we endure, We remember who we are, but to the empire, even resilience was seen as threat. The beginning of conflict, then, was not one battle, not one decree, but the steady turning of suspicion into persecution. It was the long preparation for what was to come, the slow painting of Armenians as outsiders, as enemies within. And when a people are spoken of not as neighbors, but as problems to be solved, history teaches us the danger that follows. For those who lived through those years, the change was felt in the small details of daily life. A father returning from market, weary not just from work, but from the stares of suspicion. A mother tucking her children into bed, whispering prayers not only for health, but for safety. An elder watching the horizon, sensing storms beyond the mountains. These were the first tremors, subtle but undeniable, that the ground beneath their lives was beginning to crack. As we leave this chapter, the silence of empire grows heavier and the shadow lengthens. Armenians still lived, still prayed, still loved their families, but they did so under a sky that was darkening. The first conflict was not only with weapons, but with fear, with suspicion, with the slow unraveling of belonging. And soon, that fear would ignite into something far more terrible, as the empire's silence turned into violence. When the weight of oppression grows heavy, even the quietest voices begin to rise. For Armenians within the Ottoman Empire, resistance did not first come as armies or declarations of war, but as the steady refusal to let go of dignity. It began with words, with petitions sent to the authorities, asking not for privilege, but for fairness, for protection under laws that were supposed to govern all. Intellectuals and church leaders spoke of reform, of the possibility of living in peace if only equality were honored. But such pleas, instead of being met with compassion, were twisted into proof of rebellion. To the empire, even asking for justice was seen as defiance. Small acts of resistance unfolded quietly across the land. In villages, communities organized to defend themselves against raids, keeping watch at night, forming small bands of protection with little more than farming tools. In cities, teachers insisted on continuing to teach the Armenian language, even when pressured to abandon it. Writers slipped truths into poems and songs, carrying memory through words that could not be easily silenced. These acts were fragile, but they carried immense meaning. They declared that a people would not vanish quietly into the silence imposed upon them. Yet resistance, however peaceful, became the very excuse for harsher measures. Local uprisings, born of desperation, were painted by the authorities as proof that Armenians were traitors, secretly allied with enemies of the empire. When violence broke out, it was often sparked not by calculated rebellion, but by survival. Villages refusing to hand over their sons, communities refusing to yield their grain, families refusing to abandon their faith. And each time they resisted, the punishment was swift and brutal. Massacres stained the late 19th century. Entire villages left in ashes, thousands killed under the justification of quelling rebellion. The Hamidian massacres of the 1890s, named after Sultan Abdul Hamid II, were among the first waves of terror, leaving hundreds of thousands dead. For Armenians, the message was clear. To resist was to invite death. And yet, to remain silent was also to invite erasure. It was a choice between two wounds, neither of which promised safety. And still, Armenians resisted. In the eastern provinces, self-defense units took shape, small groups of men retreating into mountains to fight back when their communities were threatened. They were not soldiers trained for war, but farmers, shepherds, artisans, ordinary men who picked up arms because they could not bear to watch their families slaughtered without answer. Their battles were small, often desperate, but they carried with them the deep conviction that survival was itself a form of victory. For every clash, there were countless tragedies. Families fled into the wilderness, carrying what little they could, watching homes burn behind them. Mothers whispered prayers as they hid their children, hoping the soldiers would pass without searching. Fathers, dragged away by authorities, left behind silence at dinner tables where their voices once gave comfort. The scars of these early conflicts etched themselves into the fabric of Armenian life, teaching each generation that their existence was fragile and yet worth defending. What made this resistance remarkable was not its scale, but its persistence. Though each act seemed small against the weight of empire, together they formed a current of defiance that could not be extinguished. Armenians carried within them the understanding that to live, to remember, to continue, was already to resist. And though the empire's might was overwhelming, though every clash left behind grief, the will to endure remained unbroken. As we pause here, at this stage of the story, we see Armenians caught in a cruel cycle. Each attempt to assert dignity became an excuse for greater violence, and each wave of violence planted deeper the seeds of defiance. The empire painted them as rebels. They knew themselves as survivors. The conflict had begun, not only with weapons, but with memory, with faith, with the refusal to bow fully to silence. And as the shadows lengthened, this cycle would not fade. Instead, it would intensify, pulling the Armenian people into even greater suffering, into wars and treaties that would wound them further. The first clashes were but an opening act, a dark prelude to what history now names one of the first modern genocides. The years turned heavy, and what had begun as scattered clashes grew into a prolonged struggle that stretched across decades. For the Armenians within the Ottoman Empire, survival itself became resistance, and each attempt to secure justice seemed to echo into silence. The empire, wounded by its own decline, turned again and again to its minorities as scapegoats, and the Armenians bore the weight of this suspicion more than any other. In the late 19th century, massacres swept across Armenian villages, leaving behind grief too vast to measure. The Hamidian massacres of the 1890s had already taken hundreds of thousands of lives, staining the soil with sorrow. Families mourned, communities rebuilt from ashes, only to face the threat again. And in the wake of these tragedies, the great powers of Europe, the so-called guardians of progress and civilization, demanded reforms. Promises were written into treaties, assurances of protection, of rights, of equality. Yet, these promises lived only on paper. For the empire, reforms were words offered to placate outsiders, never realities granted to those who most needed them. The Armenians knew this betrayal too well. Each treaty that carried their name brought a flicker of hope, quickly extinguished by indifference. They waited for relief that never came, for justice that never arrived. Instead, the silence deepened, and the empire's hostility grew. Even as the world looked on, Armenians remained vulnerable, bound to a state that saw them not as citizens, but as burdens. When the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 erupted, many Armenians believed a new dawn was possible. The movement spoke of liberty, equality, fraternity, words that stirred the heart and seemed to promise an end to oppression. For a brief moment, Armenians allowed themselves to hope. They celebrated in the streets, believing perhaps that history had finally turned toward them. But the promises soon unraveled. Nationalism hardened, and suspicion of minorities remained. For the ruling powers, the dream of a unified empire meant not inclusion, but uniformity. An empire where difference was not celebrated, but erased. As the First World War approached, the empire's fragility grew sharper. Surrounded by enemies, Losing land to foreign powers, it clutched tightly at control. And once more, Armenians were cast as the scapegoat. Authorities spread the claim that Armenians were conspiring with Russia, that their loyalty was divided, that they could not be trusted. It was a familiar story, repeated now with greater urgency, setting the stage for the violence to come. For Armenians, the struggle was no longer only about dignity, but about survival. Some tried to fight back, forming small defense units in the mountains. Others fled, seeking refuge in lands far away, carrying only fragments of their heritage. Many remained, hoping still that treaties, reforms, or the conscience of the world might intervene. But the treaties remained empty, the reforms never implemented, and the conscience of the world turned elsewhere. It was in this space between hope and betrayal that the deepest wounds were carved. To be promised safety and then abandoned to violence is its own kind of cruelty. To be named in documents signed by powerful nations, only to find those promises ignored, is to live in a silence that cuts deeper than words. Armenians learned that treaties could not protect them, that justice on paper could not stop soldiers at their doors. The prolonged struggle drained strength from generations. Elders carried the memory of massacres. Children inherited the fear of what might come again. Villages rebuilt after destruction only to face new threats. The weight of survival became heavier with each passing year. And yet, the people endured. They prayed in their churches. They taught their children the alphabet. They sang their songs in secret, holding on to the fragments of a world slipping away. As we pause here, on the threshold of the Great War, the story feels heavy with inevitability. The cycle of promises broken, of treaties written and ignored, of hopes raised and dashed, had prepared the way for something darker still. The prolonged struggles had not destroyed the Armenian people, but they had left them exhausted, exposed, and vulnerable to what the empire was preparing in silence. The next chapter would not be the cruelty of neglect, but the cruelty of deliberate design. And the silence that had long surrounded the Armenians would soon become the silence of graves. History often records the movements of armies and the signing of treaties, but the deepest wounds are carried quietly, in homes and families, in lives never allowed to unfold. For the Armenians under Ottoman rule, the years of genocide and persecution created not only death, but an enduring silence that shaped entire generations. These wounds were not only written in blood, but in absence, in the empty chairs at dinner tables, in the lullabies that were never sung, in the futures that were never lived. The genocide of 1915 tore through Armenian communities like a storm that did not end. Men were taken first, arrested under the pretense of disloyalty, and led away in groups. Many never returned, executed in secret or worked to death in labor camps. With the men gone, families were left vulnerable, the pillars of households removed. Mothers were forced to carry both grief and survival, shielding their children while mourning silently for husbands and brothers whose fate they already knew. Then came the marches. Entire villages were emptied, their people driven into deserts under the burning sun. Women, children, and the elderly walked for miles with little food or water. Along the roads, countless fell, their bodies left where they collapsed, unburied, unnamed. Survivors remembered the sound of crying that never ceased, the sight of mothers carrying lifeless children in their arms, unwilling to let go. These were not just deaths, they were ruptures in the very fabric of community, tearing apart bonds that had held families together for centuries. Among the most searing wounds were those carried by women. Many were abducted, forced into servitude or into marriages meant to erase their identity. Others endured violence that left scars too deep for words. Children, too, bore their share of sorrow. Orphanages filled with young faces, eyes wide with confusion, many too young to even remember the parents they had lost. Some children were taken into foreign homes, given new names, new religions, new languages, taught to forget who they were. These were the lost generations, uprooted not only from land, but from memory itself. For those who survived, the trauma lingered like a shadow that never left. Families that once gathered in warmth now live scattered, in exile or in silence. In the diaspora, Armenians carried fragments of their culture across oceans, preserving what they could: recipes, songs, prayers, yet always with the ache of what had been left behind. In villages reduced to rubble, survivors rebuilt, but the ghosts of the past walked beside them. They lived with the constant reminder of who was missing, of what had been erased. The social fabric of the Armenian people was torn, yet not completely destroyed. In whispered stories, in hidden keepsakes, in the teaching of the ancient alphabet to children, memory endured. But the endurance came at a cost. Generations grew up under the weight of their parents' grief, carrying sorrow they had not lived but inherited. The silence of survivors, those who could not bring themselves to recount the horrors, became another kind of wound. For the children, absence was its own inheritance. The absence of grandparents who were gone, of villages that no longer existed, of a homeland that could never again be whole. These are the wounds that history's books often fail to capture. They are not measured in numbers, though numbers were vast. They are measured instead in the quiet grief that stretched across decades, in the way entire generations grew up with songs cut short, traditions broken, names forgotten. The genocide was not only an ending of lives, it was an ending of continuity, a fracture in the passing down of memory from one generation to the next. And yet, within this devastation, Armenians found ways to endure. Survivors raised children in new lands, teaching them the language and faith of their ancestors. Communities in exile built churches and schools, keeping alive what was nearly destroyed. The lost generations, though wounded, became also the carriers of resilience. Their very survival was an act of defiance against the silence the empire had tried to impose. As we pause here, reflecting on the vastness of this loss, we recognize that the true measure of genocide is not only in the dead, but in the lives unlived, in the generations deprived of wholeness. These wounds remain, echoing even now, shaping identity, memory, and grief. And as the story moves toward its close, we carry with us the understanding that such wounds do not fade easily. They remain in silence, in remembrance, in the unspoken weight of history. When we look back on the Armenian genocide, we are not only looking at the destruction of lives, we are listening to an echo that still vibrates in silence, a wound that crosses generations, and a truth that asks us not to forget. History here is not distant. It is alive in memory, in absence, in the quiet ways that people carry grief long after the violence has ended. The Ottoman Empire sought to erase the Armenians from its lands, to turn them into shadows scattered by the desert winds. Yet, even in the face of such cruelty, the people endured. Survivors carried fragments of their culture, an old prayer, a recipe, a melody, and built new lives in places far from their ancestral soil. They became a people of memory, bound together by what they had lost, but also by what they refused to let slip away. Reflection brings us to an unsettling truth. Silence itself can be violent. For decades, the genocide was denied, its memory dismissed, its victims unnamed. This denial was another wound, one that made survivors feel unseen, their suffering unacknowledged. To endure violence is one kind of pain, to have it erased is another. And yet, Armenians continue to remember. In whispered stories, in annual commemorations, In the teaching of their children, they resisted the empire's silence by keeping memory alive. There is a lesson here that speaks beyond one people, beyond one moment in history. It reminds us that empire, when it seeks to control through fear, often turns first to those most vulnerable. It reminds us that prejudice, left unchecked, can grow into cruelty that strips away humanity. And it reminds us too that forgetting allows wounds to fester, while remembrance, however heavy, becomes a form of healing. This story is not only about pain, it is also about resilience. To endure is itself an act of defiance. To carry identity forward, even when scattered, is a victory against those who sought to erase it. The Armenian people, though scarred, have shown the world that memory can outlast empire, that silence can be broken by remembrance, that survival itself is a kind of triumph. As we sit with this reflection, let us imagine Armenia not only as a land of tragedy, but as a land of endurance. Picture the mountains that still rise like guardians, the churches whose stones still stand, the voices of children still learning the ancient alphabet. Picture the diaspora communities across the world, carrying forward traditions that might have been lost, lighting candles in memory, singing songs that echo across time. These are acts of remembrance, but also acts of renewal. And so, when we close this story, we do not close it with finality, for the story of the Armenian genocide does not end in 1915. It continues in memory, in the descendants of survivors, in the voices that refuse to be silent. It is a reminder that history lives not only in books, but in the human heart. And when that heart chooses to remember, even the heaviest silence can be broken. Tonight, as the story fades into quiet, we are left with a truth both painful and profound, that the silence of empire sought to erase, but the strength of memory has endured. And in that endurance lies the lesson we must carry, that no people, no matter how persecuted, should ever be reduced to silence again. Let this story rest with you gently, like a lullaby carried on the wind. Let it remind you that history is not only about power and cruelty, but also about resilience, survival, and the unyielding light of memory. And as we close our eyes, we may hear in the stillness of night the voices of those who came before, whispering not only of sorrow, but of dignity that endures even through empire's silence.